Pilot's affair with Dubai Sheikh leads to deadly HIV revenge. Shocking twist for co-pilot. What happens when the past comes crashing down? A female pilot's affair spirals into a deadly game of revenge, leading her into a storm that will change her forever. But when the storm isn't just the weather and the reckoning is inevitable, can she survive the darkness that awaits? Stay tuned till the end to witness the shocking twist that will leave you questioning everything. You won't see this coming. The cabin was silent, the hum of the engines the only sound. Captain Layla stood in the cockpit, her grip tight on the controls. She'd flown thousands of miles, but today felt different. The air outside, thick with desert heat, pressed against the windows. A storm was coming. Inside her, a storm of a different kind. Layla felt it in her chest, heavy, like a weight she couldn't shake. Her mind kept drifting back to him. The Sheikh, Dubai, the affair, the lies, the betrayal. She couldn't forget it, not after what had happened. Her co-pilot, Alex, was at the controls beside her. He had no idea. He couldn't. Layla looked over at him, his face calm, composed. She knew the type, always cool under pressure. But today, there was no pressure for him. He didn't know the real pressure Layla was under. The thing she had done. The thing she was about to finish. It was time. Layla's hands tightened on the controls. She could feel it, that creeping dread, wrapping around her throat. A sudden thought. Had she made a mistake? No. There was no turning back. The plan was already set. Her fingers brushed the switch. Alex didn't see. His eyes were on the horizon, unaware of the looming danger. But Layla could see it. The storm, the turbulence, the chaos in the air. It was coming, and she couldn't stop it. She swallowed hard, feeling the cold sweat forming on her skin. Her heart raced faster now, echoing in her ears. It was too late to change her mind. What she had done would catch up with them, and soon it would all explode. Layla gritted her teeth. Her hand moved with precision. She knew exactly what she was doing, but she wasn't ready for what would happen next. Alex was still unaware, but something in the air had shifted. Something felt wrong. The cabin grew colder. The storm outside was no longer just wind. It was something else. Layla's stomach churned. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. What had she set in motion? Her vision blurred, and then the sudden jolt. A tremor ran through the plane. Alex's voice cut through the tension. What was that? Layla's breath caught. Her fingers trembled, but she kept control. For now. But her mind was a whirlwind. A sinking feeling in her gut. Something was terribly wrong. And then a message flashed on the screen. A warning. Layla's hand shot to the button. She couldn't believe it. The world seemed to tilt around her. A laugh, bitter and hollow, echoed in her mind. She knew then. This was no ordinary storm. This was her reckoning. The warning blinked again, urgent, relentless. Layla's heart thudded. Her fingers hovered over the controls, shaking. Alex turned to her, concern creeping into his voice. Captain? What's going on? Her mind raced. She knew she had no choice but to act. She pressed the button. A soft beep, then silence. For a moment, everything seemed still. Too still. Layla's eyes darted to the monitor, tracking the flight path. The system was malfunctioning. It didn't make sense. Not with the routine checks. Not with everything they'd done to prepare. Her thoughts flashed back to that night, to the hotel room, to the moment she found the envelope on the pillow. The virus. The revenge. It hadn't been a threat. It had been a promise. She closed her eyes, the memory of the Sheikh's last words slicing through her. Asterisk, it's not enough to destroy you, Layla. It's the ones you love that will suffer. Asterisk. Alex didn't deserve this. But what could she do now? Her hand hovered over the emergency override. but something in her gut told her not to press it. The storm outside had intensified, the turbulence shaking the plane. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The cabin buzzed with a sharp, crackling noise. A low growl of thunder rumbled from the distance, almost as if the sky was warning them. Layla's breathing grew shallow. She was trapped by her own actions, by the weight of the past. But there was no escaping it now. Alex glanced nervously out the window. The horizon was gone. Only a dark, swirling blackness. "Captain?" His voice was edged with panic. Layla's throat tightened. This was no ordinary storm. It was a warning. Her eyes locked with his, but she couldn't speak. Her mouth went dry. Alex's face paled as the turbulence worsened. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the cockpit. A warning bell. Then another jolt. The plane lurched violently. Layla gripped the controls with all her strength. She could hear Alex shouting, but his words were drowned in the roar of the storm. This is it, Layla thought. The consequences of her choices had arrived. The storm outside was closing in, and inside her, the fear was swallowing her whole. Would they survive this? Would Alex ever know the truth? As the plane bucked and groaned, Layla stared out at the swirling chaos beyond. She couldn't help but wonder if this was how it ended. A violent storm, inside and out. The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Layla's hands were numb from gripping the controls, her knuckles white. Alex was now scrambling, trying to stabilize the plane, but the storm was relentless. The flashing warnings filled the cockpit. Red lights blinked in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder that things were spiraling out of control. Her heart pounded in her chest, matching the thunder outside. Layla's breath came in short gasps, each one more frantic than the last. She stole a glance at Alex. His face was etched with fear now, eyes wide. But it wasn't just the storm that terrified him. It was the realization that something was terribly wrong. The systems malfunctioning, the erratic movements of the plane, the storm unnatural and closing in. Layla could feel it in her gut. The virus, the revenge. She had no idea how, but she knew the Sheikh had orchestrated this. Her thoughts scrambled, piecing together the fragments. The plane systems should have been fine. She'd made sure of it. But this wasn't about the storm. It was about the virus. It was inside. Alex was the target. The jolt was no longer the plane's tremors. It was something more sinister. Layla's stomach churned, her mind racing through every dark possibility. Her breath hitched as she turned to Alex, her voice trembling. Alex, we need to land." He didn't respond at first. His hands moved across the panel, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. The weight of the moment crashed down. The moment Layla realized, he was already showing symptoms. His skin pale and clammy, his breath ragged. She froze, horror coursing through her veins. How could she have been so blind? The virus. It was inside him. The same one she had feared. The one the Sheikh had made sure would spread. Alex coughed, and Layla could see it. The faint red streak on his lips. A cough that shouldn't have been. He looked at her, his voice a whisper. "Layla, what's happening?" His eyes empty, lost. He doesn't know, she thought, her throat tight. He can't know. The air felt thick, suffocating. The storm outside was now a roar, deafening in the confined space of the cockpit. Layla glanced at the radar. No sign of an airport for miles. She was trapped, and Alex, her co-pilot, was slipping further into the nightmare. Her pulse quickened. It was too late. The virus was taking hold. The Sheikh's revenge was unfolding right in front of her. The storm wasn't the only thing tearing them apart now, and Layla couldn't stop it. The darkness inside the plane mirrored the one outside, and in that moment, Layla knew there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. The storm howled outside, a beast clawing at the aircraft. But inside, it was deathly still, save for the ragged breaths of Alex beside her. He was fading fast. Layla's mind screamed for action, but her body refused to move. Her thoughts were a blur. The virus was in him. Her betrayal. The Sheikh's twisted revenge. Alex's condition was worsening by the second. His hands shook violently as he gripped the controls, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Layla could feel the air around them grow thick, suffocating. The lights flickered again, casting eerie shadows across the cockpit. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced at the radar once more. Still no sign of a landing strip. The storm had consumed the sky, and there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Alex's eyes fluttered, confusion overtaking his face. Layla, He choked, coughing again, blood staining his lips. Her stomach turned. She looked away, but there was no escaping the truth. He wasn't going to survive this. Layla's heart hammered, her every instinct telling her to act, to help him. But how? She had no idea how to stop what was happening. The virus was inside him now. It was too late for a cure, too late for redemption. And she couldn't bring herself to do it, to end the suffering. Not yet. The storm outside was closing in, the turbulence more violent. The plane groaned, metal creaking under the strain. Layla's hands gripped the edge of her seat. Her mind raced. Was there anything left she could do? Anything at all? She glanced at Alex once more. His eyes were glazing over, his breath more ragged, barely able to stay conscious. Her hand hovered over the controls, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. If she didn't act soon, they would both be lost in the storm. The thought of that darkness, of the Sheikh's wrath, sent chills down her spine. She could feel it, closing in, tightening around her throat. There was no escape. She thought of her past, her affair, the lies, the revenge. But this was bigger than any of that. This was life or death. She turned to Alex. "Hold on, Alex." Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. But he couldn't hear her anymore. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside. And Layla knew there was no one left to save them. The reckoning had arrived. The plane shook violently again, the sound of metal twisting and groaning deafening. Layla's heart thudded in her chest. She watched helplessly as Alex's eyes fluttered closed, his grip on the controls loosening. His head lolled to one side, pale and drained of color. She should have acted sooner. Now it was too late. The storm outside had become a blur of black and gray, no longer a storm but a swirling abyss. Layla's hands were trembling, sweat beading on her forehead. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Everything inside her screamed for her to do something, anything. But there was nothing left to do. The virus was coursing through Alex's veins, too fast to fight. She had seen it happen before. Her own reflection in the glass was nothing more than a shadow now, a specter of her past mistakes. And the only thing she could do was watch as it all unraveled. The warning alarms were still blaring, more urgent now, echoing in her ears. But they felt distant, irrelevant, like a world that no longer mattered. Alex, her voice cracked, barely audible over the roaring wind. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. But there was no response. The storm outside was growing fiercer. The turbulence, so intense it felt like the plane was about to tear apart. Layla's vision blurred, her thoughts scattered. She closed her eyes for just a second, trying to gather herself. But when she opened them again, it was as if the world had shifted. A piercing crack of thunder split the air, and then an unnatural stillness. The plane, once vibrating with the storm's force, seemed to hover in a strange, suspended silence. Layla's breath caught. It was as if the storm had vanished, leaving only an eerie calm in its wake. The monitors, once flashing red with warnings, now showed nothing. The engines, which had been roaring, were silent. Her pulse quickened as she turned to Alex. His face was twisted in pain, eyes wide open now, but lifeless. His chest was still, no rise, no fall. He was gone. The storm was still out there, but inside the cockpit, there was nothing left but the echo of her own breathing. She hadn't saved him, and now she was alone. The plane had entered a vast, empty expanse of sky. There was nothing around them, no land, no sign of civilization, just an endless, cold blackness stretching out in all directions. Layla's grip on the controls tightened once more. Her thoughts spiraled. She was trapped. The storm, the virus, the revenge. She had brought this upon herself. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating. She could no longer feel the sharp sting of betrayal, only the crushing weight of what had been lost. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. But there was one thing she knew now. She couldn't run from what she'd done. The reckoning had come, and there was no escaping it. Not now. Not ever. The silence stretched on, deep and suffocating. Layla stared at the empty horizon through the cockpit window. A vast, endless void. Her mind was numb, yet painfully awake, piecing together the fragments of her life. She had failed. The storm outside was still there, but now it seemed so distant, as though it were no longer part of the world she inhabited. The roar of the engines was gone. The alarms had stopped. There was nothing but the darkness closing in, both inside and outside the plane. Her fingers lingered on the controls, but she didn't know where to take them. She wasn't sure if she was even flying anymore. There was no response from the aircraft, just stillness. Her eyes flicked back to Alex. The last remnants of life had faded from his face, and the terrible truth sank in deeper. He had been a casualty, a pawn in a game she hadn't fully understood. The Sheikh's revenge had gone too far. It was no longer just about her, about their affair. It was about everything she had built, everything she had destroyed. Her stomach churned. Her vision blurred again, but she wiped her eyes, forcing herself to focus. The storm was still there, looming just beyond the plane. It was as if it were watching her, waiting. Layla's thoughts scrambled. Had she become part of the storm? Had it all been inevitable? The virus, the affair, the lies, it had all led to this moment. She had no answers, no way to turn back time, and no way to escape what had been set in motion. A sound, faint at first, reached her ears. A distant thump, a shudder. She glanced up, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, it felt like the plane had jolted back to life. But it was only the wind, the storm, pushing them. The control was slipping away again, beyond her reach. Layla's pulse quickened as she reached for the controls once more. A low, guttural noise filled the cockpit, vibrating through her bones. The storm was back, closer now. She tried to steady her breath, but it was impossible. The weight of Alex's death, the consequences of her actions, all of it crushed down on her. She wasn't sure how long it had been since the storm had first hit. Time had blurred. All she could hear was the deafening roar of the wind, the crash of thunder above. Layla closed her eyes for a second, desperate for clarity. But when she opened them again, there was no clarity to be found. Only a terrible, unshakable realization. She was alone, in a world she had created, and there was no way to survive it. The wind howled again, a deafening scream outside the cockpit. Layla's breath hitched. The plane shuddered, more violently now, as if it were fighting to stay in the air. Her fingers gripped the controls tighter, but they felt useless in her hands. There was no escaping the pull of the storm, the weight of the world crashing down around her. She glanced at the empty seat beside her, where Alex's lifeless form had once sat. The cold emptiness inside her chest spread like a poison. She was alone, but something was different now. A new sensation, something sharp, something urgent, cut through the fog of her despair. It was the storm. It had changed, somehow. The air felt thick, charged with something dark and unpredictable. It wasn't just the wind or the thunder anymore. It was alive. Layla's heart began to race again. The storm was coming for her. But it wasn't just the weather, it was something more. Something she hadn't understood until now. The Sheikh had known. He had planned this from the beginning. This wasn't just about the virus, the revenge. It was about the destruction of everything she had ever known. Everything she had ever loved. The storm outside slammed against the plane again, rattling the cockpit, snapping her back to reality. She had to do something. She couldn't let it end like this. Her eyes locked on the dead display panel, the silent instruments. No communication, no systems, just a frozen world of nothingness. She was adrift, lost in the sky, surrounded by nothing but the storm, and it was growing stronger. A sudden burst of light illuminated the horizon outside, a flash of white that lit up the clouds like an explosion. Layla's breath caught. Her skin prickled with a cold sweat. She had seen it. The storm was closing in, no longer a natural phenomenon. It was a storm of vengeance. The Sheikh had unleashed it, and now it was tearing apart everything in its path, including her. Layla's eyes darted to the fuel gauge empty. They were running out of time. Her grip tightened on the controls, desperate for control. But her mind kept drifting back to that moment, the night everything had changed. The hotel room, the envelope, the warning. She thought she could escape it. She thought she could leave it all behind. But it had followed her, and now it was claiming its prize. Layla's head pounded, the overwhelming weight of her choices crashing down on her. She had no escape. The storm would consume her, just as it had consumed everything else. But in that final, crushing moment, something shifted. She understood. It wasn't just the storm that was chasing her. It was the reckoning. Her reckoning. And there would be no mercy. The wind howled louder, a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the plane. Layla's grip on the controls faltered, her vision blurry from exhaustion and terror. Her mind raced. There's no way out, she thought, the realization settling like a stone in her chest. The storm wasn't just an obstacle, it was her punishment. The Sheikh had orchestrated every detail. Every choice, every moment had led her here, to this final, inevitable end. Her eyes shifted to the instruments again. Nothing but static. A faint beep from the distress beacon. But that was all. No communication, no hope. She wasn't even sure the plane could make it any longer. The fuel was gone. The storm was closing in around her, suffocating. But then another shift, a violent jolt, a sharp crack of thunder, louder than before. Layla's breath caught in her throat as the cockpit filled with a sudden, unnatural cold. She looked at the empty seat beside her, her pulse spiking. It wasn't just Alex's lifeless body anymore. Something else was there, something watching. The storm outside seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, an otherworldly energy that vibrated through her bones. Layla's hands shook as she reached for the control panel again, desperately trying to regain control. But there was no control. There was nothing. The air around her thickened, the storm becoming an oppressive weight pressing in from all sides. It was as if the sky itself had turned against her. The cockpit lights flickered one last time before plunging them into total darkness. She was alone in the blackness, with only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then a voice, low, cold. You thought you could outrun it. Layla's body froze. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing inside her mind. She gasped, turning in every direction, but there was no one there. The storm roared louder, almost mocking her, And then the voice spoke again. Asterisk, you've already lost, Layla. There is no escape, asterisk. Her pulse raced, her hands trembling uncontrollably on the controls. Was it real? Was this part of the madness? Or was she slipping further into some nightmare? But the words, they cut through her. She had betrayed everything. Her duty, her conscience. And now the reckoning was final. Her eyes darted to the horizon. The storm was no longer just a violent weather pattern. It had taken form, dark and swirling, a monstrous entity closing in around her. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as the plane rocked again. She gasped for air, the oppressive weight of the storm pressing down on her. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the voice vanished. The storm, too, seemed to pause, holding its breath. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Layla gripped the controls, her thoughts scattered, her mind racing. She had nowhere to go. The storm, the voice, everything was closing in. And in the back of her mind, she heard the words once more. It's too late to change anything now. Her hands gripped the yoke, so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the cold, bitter air filling the cockpit, a foreboding sense of finality taking over. There was no escaping what she had done, no way out of the mess she had created. And in that moment, she knew, asterisk, this was it, asterisk. The storm wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The storm outside intensified again, but this time, it was different. It was almost deliberate, as if it had a purpose. Layla's hands trembled, gripping the yoke so tightly her fingers were numb. She blinked, trying to shake the haze, clouding her mind. Her breath was shallow, ragged. Each inhale felt like a struggle. She couldn't see the horizon anymore. The darkness outside had swallowed everything. The storm had become an oppressive presence, wrapping itself around the plane like a vice. It was closing in on her. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the deafening roar of the wind. The cold in the cockpit was almost unbearable now. Layla could see her breath in the air. Her chest tightened as she desperately tried to push through the fog of panic. She needed to focus. She had to stay calm. But how? The voice in her head came again, low and chilling. Asterisk, there's nothing left to save, Layla. You're already lost, asterisk. It wasn't just the storm anymore. It was the weight of her actions, of every choice that had brought her here. The affair, the lies, the virus, the blood on her hands. The storm outside wasn't just nature's fury. It was the reckoning she couldn't escape. It was the price she had to pay. Her fingers danced over the panel, but nothing responded. No systems, no communication, just the sound of her heartbeat in her ears. And then a sudden pressure, stronger this time. The plane shuddered violently, like it was being pulled apart by invisible hands. She clenched her teeth, her knuckles turning white. The world outside the cockpit was nothing but black, swirling chaos. Her thoughts swirled in tandem, but there was only one truth left. She was out of time. The storm was here, and it wasn't going to stop. Layla closed her eyes for a moment, just trying to hold onto a sliver of sanity. But then she heard it, soft at first, almost drowned by the noise of the storm. A single whisper. It's too late. She opened her eyes, but she didn't need to see it to know. The storm had already claimed her. The reckoning was final. Everything she had feared, everything she had denied, was here. It wasn't the end of the flight. It was the end of everything. The finality of it swept over her like the cold air, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. And in that moment, the cockpit, the storm, the plane, it all vanished. The world was gone. The darkness enveloped her, swallowing everything. There was no sound, no storm, no wind, just silence. Layla's heart thudded painfully in her chest, a hollow echo in the void. Her eyes snapped open. She was still in the cockpit, but the storm, gone. The plane was still, eerily still, floating in a vast expanse of nothingness. The blackness outside the window had deepened. There was no sky, no ground. Just infinite, crushing silence. Layla's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she gripped the controls. She could feel the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, a suffocating presence that filled every corner of the cockpit. Her mind raced, but there were no answers. What happened? Where am I? Her gaze flicked back to the instruments, but they were blank. Not a single light was on. No readings, no guidance. It was as if the world itself had stopped, leaving her floating in this dark, endless void. Her mind churned, desperate for an explanation. Was this death? Had the storm truly consumed her, or had it consumed something deeper inside? Her thoughts were a blur, spinning in circles, crashing into each other like waves on a shore. The voice returned, soft and chilling. "This is where it ends, Layla." She froze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It was everywhere inside her mind, in the very air around her. It wasn't the Sheikh this time. It wasn't the storm. It was something else, something deeper. Her heart skipped a beat. You cannot escape. Her pulse quickened. There was no way out of this darkness. Layla gripped the yoke tighter, her knuckles turning white. She tried to speak, but no words came. She tried to move, but it was as if the very air around her had turned to lead. She was trapped in this endless, suffocating stillness. The weight of her actions pressed on her chest, harder and harder. She had failed, and now she was lost, in the blackness, forever. Suddenly, the plane lurched forward with a sharp, jarring motion. Layla gasped, her body jerking with the force. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light in the distance. A bright pinpoint, small but undeniable. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving nothing but the oppressive darkness once more. Her mind spun wildly, struggling to make sense of it all. Was she imagining it? Had she truly seen something, or was it just a hallucination brought on by the terror, the isolation? Her body ached, the weight of her exhaustion making every second feel like an eternity. But then another flicker, this time closer, a soft glow. Layla's heart leaped. Could it be? Could there be something, anything, outside of this suffocating void? With every ounce of strength she had left, she forced her hands to move, guiding the plane toward the light. Her mind screamed for her to act, to break free, but the voice returned once more, low and cold. Asterisk, it's too late, Layla. There's no escaping what's coming for you, asterisk. She ignored it. She had to ignore it. The light was growing stronger, more defined, pulling her forward. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a sense of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely lost. But as she moved closer to the light, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was drawing her in, not to salvation, but to something far worse. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what waited on the other side, but there was no turning back now. She was already too far gone. The light grew brighter, pulling her in with an almost magnetic force. Layla's breath quickened as she fought the overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at her chest. She couldn't stop herself. Her hands moved of their own accord, guiding the plane toward the unknown. The cockpit was alive with an eerie, unnatural glow now, the once suffocating darkness fading into a pale, haunting light. Her heart pounded in her ears, louder than the whispering wind outside. The glow was so close now, filling the entire cockpit, and for a moment she thought she could hear voices, soft murmurs, just beyond her grasp. Is it real? The thought pierced her mind like a shard of glass. The plane was still shaking, but the vibrations seemed different now, almost like the plane itself was being drawn into something. something much larger than the storm. The light pulsated, and with each pulse, the air grew colder. Layla's breath fogged up the window, but she couldn't look away from the light. It was too close now. Her hands clutched the yoke tighter, as if she could somehow hold on to the last shred of reality left in her. The murmurs became louder, clearer. "Come closer, Layla." It wasn't a voice she recognized, but it was familiar in its own way, deeper, older. A sense of inevitability seeped into her bones, but still, she couldn't pull herself away. The light enveloped her now, filling the entire cockpit, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw a face, a shadow, distorted by the brilliance of the light. The face was unfamiliar, yet there was something disturbingly intimate about it. Her pulse raced. The voice, ****, cannot escape ****. Layla's eyes widened. It wasn't a voice in her head anymore. It was coming from the very heart of the light, as if it had always been there, waiting for her. "Everything you've done, everything you are, it's all led to this," she gasped, trying to break free of the paralysis, but it was impossible. The weight of those words crushed down on her chest. The storm, the virus, the lies, it had all been a prelude to this moment. The reckoning was here, and there was no escape. Her hands shook as she reached for the controls, but the plane was no longer in her control. It was as if the light was guiding it now. No, not guiding, pulling. A sudden, violent jolt shook the plane once more, and then everything stopped. The light, the voices, the whispers, it all vanished. And for a brief moment, Layla thought she was free. But then the cockpit fell into an unnatural stillness, as if time itself had paused. Her breath came in jagged bursts, and she realized she had been falling deeper than the storm, deeper than the darkness. There was no ground beneath her, no sky above. She was trapped in an endless void, just as the voice had promised. There is no escape. And in that final, paralyzing moment, Layla understood the truth. The storm had never been the real enemy. It had been the beginning of her own unraveling, and now there was nothing left to hold on to. She had crossed a line long ago, and now she was paying the price. There was no plane to fly, no hope, just the endless darkness stretching out before her. And as the world faded away, the last thing she heard was the whisper of that voice, now colder than ever. "Welcome to your end." The darkness pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. Layla's pulse hammered in her ears, but there was no sound except the weight of silence. The storm had been a mere prelude to what she was now facing. The void stretched out in all directions, endless and cold. She was suspended in nothingness, weightless, adrift. Her hands still gripped the yoke instinctively, but the plane was no longer a plane. It was a shell, drifting without purpose. She tried to focus, tried to make sense of the emptiness, but there was nothing to grasp onto. No ground beneath her, no sky above, just a cold, unyielding blackness that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. And then a flash, a flicker of light in the distance, faint but undeniable. Layla's heart jumped. She wasn't sure if it was real or just a hallucination, but something deep inside her stirred. Was it hope? Was it the end? Or a new beginning? She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, trying to make sense of the light. It grew brighter, pulling her in, just like the storm had. But this time, there was no fear, only a quiet resignation. The light surrounded her now, warm and cold all at once, as though it held everything and nothing in its grasp. She could feel it, deep in her bones, the pull of something ancient, something inevitable. You thought you could escape. The voice was back. It was the same, but different, deeper. You can't outrun what you are. Layla closed her eyes, the words sinking into her. There was no escape. Not from herself. Not from the storm. not from the darkness that had always followed her, just beneath the surface. Her body trembled as she let go of the yoke, no longer needing to control the plane or anything else. She let go of everything, the guilt, the fear, the anger. All of it faded away, swallowed by the light. In the silence that followed, she realized the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the reckoning she'd been running from all along. And there, in the blackness, she finally understood. She had always been a part of the storm. The light around her began to fade, gradually dissolving into the endless expanse of darkness. Layla's body felt lighter now, as if the weight of everything had finally slipped away. The storm, the guilt, the fear, they had all melted into the vastness, leaving behind only an eerie stillness. She could no longer tell if her eyes were open or closed. Time no longer mattered here. There was no urgency, no need for answers. In this space, all was at rest. She let herself drift. For the first time, there was no push to fight, no need to outrun the past. There was only the quiet, a profound silence that swallowed everything whole. Layla thought she could hear the faintest whisper, but it wasn't the voice of the storm or the Sheikh or anyone from her past. It was her own voice, a soft murmur inside her, one that had been buried beneath the weight of everything she'd tried to escape. "I'm sorry." The words felt strange, but they were true. For the first time, Layla understood what she had done to herself. How far she'd pushed, how far she'd run, only to circle back to this place, to the truth. And in that truth, she found peace. Not the peace of forgetting, or of undoing the damage, but the peace of acceptance. The storm had come for her, yes, but it had also led her here, to a place where there were no more battles, no more choices to make, where the past could no longer haunt her. And with that understanding, Layla exhaled for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The darkness around her began to shift, as if in response to her release. It no longer felt cold. It felt warm, gentle, embracing. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was freeing. The final remnants of the storm, of the reckoning, faded into the distance. And in their place, there was nothing but the quiet of the void and the soft, unspoken promise that some endings weren't meant to be fought. They were simply meant to be. And with that, Layla's journey, her reckoning, came to its quiet, graceful close.